Violet Albina Gibson was 50 years old when she decided to change the course of history. She had been many things in her life: the daughter of an Irish peer, a woman of means and education, a convert to Catholicism, a mystic who heard voices in the night, a patient in sanitariums across Europe, but she had never been a killer. Not until that bright April morning in Rome, when she stood in the Piazza del Campidoglio with a small pistol tucked inside her black jacket, waiting for Benito Mussolini to emerge from the Palazzo Dei Conservatory. The years leading to that moment had been a gradual descent into what others called madness, but what Violet understood as clarity. Born in Dublin in 1876, she was the youngest daughter of Edward Gibson, the first Baron Ashbourne, Lord Chancellor of Ireland. Her childhood was one of privilege and expectation, of grand houses and formal dinners, of being taught to speak French and Italian, to play the piano, to comport herself with the grace befitting her station. But there had always been something else inside her, something restless and dissatisfied, a hunger for meaning that her comfortable life could never satisfy. In her 20s, she converted to Catholicism, much to her Protestant family's dismay. It wasn't rebellion so much as necessity. She felt called to it, drawn by something she couldn't explain even to herself. She threw herself into charitable work, visiting the poor in London's East End, nursing the sick, praying for hours until her knees ached against the stone floors of churches. But the voices came anyway. Sometimes they were God's voice, she thought. Sometimes they were her own mind, fragmenting under the weight of what she saw in the world: the injustice, the suffering, the rise of men like Mussolini, who promised order but delivered only brutality. Her family had her committed to private hospitals, first in England, then in France. The doctors spoke of melancholia, of religious mania, of hysteria, that catch-all diagnosis for women who felt too much or thought too deeply. They gave her rest cures and cold baths and drugs that made her thoughts slow and thick. She learned to lie convincingly, to tell them she no longer heard voices, to smile and behave in ways that suggested she had recovered. They released her again and again, and each time she went back into the world, trying to find her purpose. By 1926, she was living modestly in Rome in a small pension near the Tiber. She had little money left. Her family's patience and generosity had worn thin after so many years of hospitals and treatments. She survived on a small allowance, spent her days walking the ancient streets, attending Mass at whichever church called to her that morning. She read newspapers obsessively, following the news from Italy and beyond. Mussolini's face stared out from every front page, his jaw thrust forward, his eyes hard with certainty. Il Duce, the leader, the man who had seized power 4 years earlier with his march on Rome, who had consolidated control through intimidation and violence, whose black shirts beat and murdered anyone who opposed him. Violet understood what others seemed blind to. She saw that Mussolini was not a savior but a disease, a cancer spreading through Italy and threatening to metastasize across Europe. She heard God's voice clearly now, without confusion, without the fog of medication. She was being called to act, not from madness, but from moral necessity. Someone had to stop him. Someone had to be willing to sacrifice everything. She bought the pistol from a pawn shop, a small revolver easily concealed. She practiced loading it in her room, her hands surprisingly steady. She had never fired a gun before, but she didn't need to be an expert marksman. She would be close enough. She chose April 7th because she read that Mussolini would be attending a conference on international medicine at the capital. He would be surrounded by crowds, by admirers and dignitaries, but there would be a moment, there was always a moment, when she could get close. The morning arrived cool and bright, the Roman sky, that particular shade of blue that made everything seem sharper, more real. Violet, dressed carefully in a dark suit, pinned her gray-streaked hair back neatly. She looked in the mirror and saw a woman who appeared utterly ordinary, forgettable, perfect. She tucked the pistol into her jacket pocket, feeling its weight against her ribs like a second heart. She left her room without breakfast, walked through the waking streets toward the Capitol Hill. The piazza was already crowded when she arrived. Italian flags hung from balconies and police lined the streets, but the security was surprisingly lax. This was before the age of metal detectors and body scans, before assassinations had become so common that every public figure moved through the world in an armored cocoon. Violet positioned herself near the entrance to the palazzo, close to where Mussolini's car would arrive. She waited, her hand resting lightly in her pocket, fingers touching the cool metal of the gun. Around her, people chattered excitedly. Women held children on their hips, pointing toward the building's entrance. Men smoked and read newspapers, checking their watches. No one paid attention to the thin, middle-aged Irish woman standing quietly at the edge of the crowd. That was always how it worked, Violet thought. Women of a certain age became invisible, dismissed as harmless, irrelevant. She had counted on that. The car arrived just after noon, a black Lancia flanked by motorcycles. The crowd surged forward and police pushed them back, creating a narrow corridor. Mussolini emerged from the vehicle and Violet felt her breath catch despite herself. He was shorter than she expected, his famous jaw even more prominent in person, his military uniform crisp and adorned with medals. He moved with the confidence of someone who believed himself invincible, chosen by fate. He paused to acknowledge the crowd, raising his hand in that fascist salute, and people cheered. Violet began moving forward, slipping between bodies, using her small frame and unremarkable appearance to drift closer. A policeman glanced at her and looked away, just another admirer, another nobody. Her heart pounded now, blood rushing in her ears, but her mind was perfectly calm. She thought of all the people Mussolini had destroyed, all the violence he would unleash if he continued unchecked. She thought of her brother dead from illness years ago, of her father who never understood her, of all the women she'd met in hospitals who'd been locked away for refusing to be silent. She thought of God and whether this was truly his will or her own desperate need for meaning. Mussolini was turning now, heading toward the entrance. She was perhaps 10 feet away. She pulled the pistol from her pocket, raised it, aimed at his head. Her finger found the trigger. She fired. The sound was surprisingly small, swallowed by the crowd's noise. The bullet grazed Mussolini's nose, a near miss that drew blood but caused no serious damage. For a split second, everything froze, Mussolini's hand going to his face, his expression one of shock rather than pain, the crowd beginning to understand what had happened. Then chaos erupted. Violet tried to fire again, but hands were already grabbing her, pulling the gun away. She felt herself being thrown to the ground, the pavement scraping her face. Someone kicked her in the ribs. People were screaming, some in fear, some in rage. She could hear Mussolini's voice above it all, already playing the role of the invincible leader, calling out that he was fine, that nothing could stop him. The crowd's anger turned toward her like a living thing. Hands clawed at her clothes, her hair. Someone spat in her face. The police were pulling her up now, dragging her away, and she caught one last glimpse of Mussolini, handkerchief pressed to his bleeding nose, already turning the assassination attempt into theater, into propaganda. As they hauled her toward a police van, Violet felt neither regret nor satisfaction. She had tried. She had acted when others only talked. The bullet had missed perhaps God's will after all, or simply her own lack of skill, but she had broken the myth of Mussolini's untouchability. She had shown that he was mortal, vulnerable, that someone was willing to stand against him even at the cost of everything. As the van doors closed behind her and darkness swallowed her up, she wondered what would come next. The interrogation room at the Questura was small and windowless, lit by a single harsh bulb hanging from the ceiling. They had left Violet there for hours after her arrest, still wearing her torn and bloodied clothes, her face swollen where she'd been struck. Her ribs ached from the kicks she'd received in the Piazza. No water, no food, no explanation of what would happen next. Just the chair, the table, and the terrible fluorescent light that made her eyes water and her head pound. When the door finally opened, 3 men entered. The first was a police inspector, middle-aged with a thick mustache and cold eyes. The second was younger, an officer who positioned himself near the door, hand resting on his holster. The third man wore civilian clothes, an expensive suit, well-tailored, and carried himself with the authority of someone who operated outside normal chains of command. Later, Violet would learn he was from Oviara Mussolini's secret police, the organization that specialized in making problems disappear. Signorina Gibson, the inspector began, his Italian clipped and harsh. Do you understand the gravity of what you have done? Violet met his gaze steadily. Her hands were cuffed in front of her, resting on the scarred wooden table. She noticed her knuckles were bleeding, though she couldn't remember how that had happened. I understand perfectly, she said in fluent Italian. I attempted to rid the world of a tyrant. The slap came so fast she didn't have time to brace for it. The inspector's hand connected with her cheek, snapping her head to the side. Pain exploded across her face, fresh blood filling her mouth. Where her teeth cut into the soft tissue, she tasted copper and salt. You will speak respectfully of Il Duce, the inspector said. His voice hadn't changed, still flat and bureaucratic, as if he were correcting a minor clerical error. Violet turned her head back slowly, looking at him again. She could feel her cheeks swelling, the heat of it spreading across her face. I will speak the truth, she said quietly. That's all I've ever done. The man from Oviara stepped forward, pulling out the chair across from her and sitting down. He studied her with the detached interest of an entomologist, examining a particularly unusual insect. You are not Italian, he said in accented English. You are the daughter of a British peer, an Irishwoman. What possessed you to involve yourself in Italian affairs? Tyranny is everyone's affair, Violet replied. Evil doesn't respect borders. He smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Evil. You speak of evil while you attempted to murder a man in broad daylight. You are aware that our legal code permits the death penalty for such an act? I'm aware, Violet said. I expected nothing less. The inspector slammed his palm on the table, making her jump despite her determination to remain calm. Why? He demanded. Why would you throw away your life for this? You are nobody. You have achieved nothing. Your family has already disowned you. The British Embassy tells us they will not intervene on your behalf. You are completely alone and you will hang for this, and within a week no one will even remember your name. Something about his words struck deeper than the physical violence had, the loneliness of it, the absolute isolation she had chosen. Her family, her brother Willie, her sister Frances, they would be mortified, horrified. They had tried so hard to help her over the years, and this was how she repaid them, by becoming an assassin, a criminal, a mad woman in the newspapers. She felt tears prick her eyes and blinked them back furiously. She would not give them the satisfaction. I will remember my name, she said, and God will remember. The Aviara man leaned back in his chair, lighting a cigarette. God, he repeated, letting smoke drift from his nostrils. Yes, we've been informed of your religious enthusiasms, your stays in various asylums, your history of mental instability. Tell me, Signorina Gibson, whose voice was it that told you to pull that trigger, God's or the voice of your own madness? It was a question she had asked herself 1,000 times over the years. How did one distinguish between divine inspiration and the symptoms of a fractured mind? The mystics and the lunatics heard the same voices, saw the same visions. The only difference was whether history vindicated them. Does it matter? Violet asked. The result is the same. I acted according to my conscience. Your conscience, the inspector spat. Aldous could have been killed, the greatest leader Italy has ever known, struck down by a mentally ill spinster. Do you know what happened in the Piazza after you were arrested? The crowd wanted to tear you apart. It took a dozen police officers to prevent them from lynching you on the spot. And do you know what Aldous did? He waved them off. He gave a speech, blood still dripping from his nose, telling them that Italy was strong, that one deranged woman could not shake the foundations of our nation. He attended the entire medical conference, refused treatment for hours to show his strength. He made you look like what you are, a pathetic, harmless lunatic. The words were meant to wound, and they did. Violet had failed. She had been so close, and yet the bullet had only grazed him, a flesh wound, barely an inconvenience. Already Mussolini was turning it into propaganda, proof of his invincibility. The newspapers would write about his courage, his stoicism, and she would be remembered, if at all, as a crazy woman who couldn't even shoot straight. Perhaps I am mad, Violet said slowly. Perhaps I have been mad for years, but madness doesn't make me wrong about him. You know what he is. You know what he's doing to this country. You serve him, but you're not stupid. You can see it. For just a moment, something flickered across the Aviara man's face. Not agreement exactly, but a kind of weary recognition. Then it was gone, replaced by the smooth mask of the professional interrogator. What we see, he said, is an anarchist who attempted to assassinate the head of state. Whether you acted alone or as part of a conspiracy, whether you are insane or merely evil, these are questions we will determine. For now, you will be held in custody pending trial. And I should warn you, Signorina, that Italian prisons are not comfortable places, especially for prisoners who have earned the enmity of the state. They took her from the interrogation room to a holding cell deep in the building's basement. The walls wept with moisture, and the smell of human waste was overwhelming. There were no windows, no natural light, just the dim glow from a bulb in the corridor outside the bars. They removed her handcuffs only to chain her ankle to a ring bolted into the wall, limiting her movement to a radius of perhaps 4 feet. There was no bed, just a stone floor and a thin, filthy blanket. The guards who delivered her meal, if the bowl of watery soup and hard bread could be called a meal, looked at her with undisguised contempt. One of them spat on the floor near her feet. English whore, he muttered. The other one laughed. Violet said nothing. She had learned long ago that silence was sometimes the only form of dignity available. She ate the food because she needed to maintain her strength, though every swallow nauseated her. She drank the brackish water because dehydration would only make everything worse. And when night came, or what she assumed was night given the absence of natural light, she wrapped herself in the blanket despite its smell and tried to sleep. The dreams that came were vivid and strange. She saw Mussolini's face over and over the moment the bullet struck, but in her dreams the shot was true. She saw him fall, saw the life leave his eyes, saw the crowd's adulation turn to chaos and fear. She saw other things too, her father long dead looking at her with disappointment, her mother who had never understood her religious fervor, her brother Willie who had tried so hard to protect her from herself. She saw the asylum in Paris where she'd spent 6 months, the white walls and the screaming patients and the doctors who touched her with hands that were supposed to heal but felt like violations. She woke to the sound of her own crying, tears she didn't remember shedding soaking the thin blanket. Her body ached everywhere, her face where she'd been struck, her ribs from the kicks, her ankle from the shackle. But worse than the physical pain was the crushing weight of failure, of knowing that she had sacrificed everything and accomplished nothing. In the darkness of that cell, Violet Gibson began to understand that the bullet had been the easy part. Pulling the trigger had taken only a moment of courage, a brief willingness to step outside the bounds of civilized behavior. But what came next? Surviving the consequences, maintaining her sense of purpose and identity in the face of punishment and degradation, that would require a different kind of strength entirely. The trial, when it finally came 3 weeks later, was less a judicial proceeding than a piece of political theater. Violet was brought into the courtroom in chains, flanked by guards, her appearance shocking even to herself. She had caught a glimpse of her reflection in a window and barely recognized the gaunt, hollow-eyed woman staring back. The Italian press filled the gallery, their cameras flashing, capturing her degradation for newspapers across Europe. She could imagine the headlines: "Mad Englishwoman, Failed Assassin, the Spinster Who Missed." Her court-appointed lawyer, a nervous young man named Giuseppe Moretti, had visited her once in her cell. He had been apologetic but clear. There was no defense to mount. She had attempted to murder the head of state in front of hundreds of witnesses. The only question was whether she would be executed or declared insane. He recommended she say nothing, let him argue for her mental incompetence. It was her only chance at survival. Violet had agreed, not because she believed herself insane, but because she understood the game being played. Mussolini didn't want a martyr. He didn't want a trial that would drag on for months, giving her a platform to articulate her political objections to fascism. He wanted her dismissed, forgotten, erased from history as quickly as possible. Mental illness was the perfect solution. It delegitimized her act, made it meaningless. Not a political assassination attempt, but merely the delusions of a sick mind. The prosecution presented her history methodically, her multiple stays in mental institutions, her religious mania, her estrangement from her family. They brought in doctors who had treated her in England and France, who testified about her hearing voices, her belief that God spoke to her directly, her previous suicide attempts. Yes, there had been two, once with poison and once by throwing herself from a window, though she'd only broken her arm in the latter attempt. They painted a picture of a woman who had been mentally ill for decades, whose action was the inevitable culmination of unchecked insanity. Moretti called no witnesses in her defense. He simply stood and argued that Signorina Gibson was clearly non compos mentis, unable to understand the nature of her actions, and therefore should be committed to an institution rather than executed. He spoke quickly, mechanically, as if eager to finish and distance himself from the whole sordid affair. The judges deliberated for less than an hour. When they returned, the verdict was exactly as everyone expected: not guilty by reason of insanity, but the sentence was worse than death in some ways. She would be deported to England and committed indefinitely to a mental asylum. She would disappear from public view, locked away where she could embarrass no one, threaten no one, inspire no one. The British government arranged her transfer with brutal efficiency. They wanted her gone from Italy as badly as Mussolini did. On May 3rd, 1926, less than a month after her arrest, Violet was driven to Rome's Termini station under heavy guard, placed on a train bound for Calais, and then ferried across the Channel to England. She never saw Italy again. The asylum they chose was St. Andrew's Hospital in Northampton, a massive Victorian institution that housed over 1,000 patients. It was where England sent people it wanted to forget: the mentally ill poor, the criminally insane, the politically inconvenient. Violet arrived on a gray spring morning, still wearing the soiled clothes from her cell in Rome, and was processed like a piece of cargo. A nurse cut off her hair for hygiene, she explained, though Violet suspected it was also punishment, a way of stripping away the last vestiges of her identity. They took her clothes, gave her a shapeless institutional dress, recorded her name and her crime in a ledger, and led her to Ward C, the section for violent and dangerous patients. Her cell, they called it a room, but it was a cell, was perhaps 8 feet by 10, with a narrow bed bolted to the floor, a small table and chair, and a chamber pot in the corner. A single window too high to reach let in a gray square of English sky. The door had a viewing slot that the nurses could open to check on her, and it locked from the outside with a heavy bolt. For the first weeks, Violet was kept in almost complete isolation. She was allowed out of her cell for 1 hour per day to walk in a small exercise yard surrounded by high walls. She was given meals through the slot in her door, the same bland institutional food at the same times every day: porridge for breakfast, boiled vegetables and meat of indeterminate origin for lunch and dinner. No visitors were permitted, no letters in or out. The doctors explained that she needed to stabilize before they could begin treatment. Treatment, she learned, meant a rotation of experimental therapies popular in the late 1920s. First came the continuous baths. She would be placed in a tub of lukewarm water for hours at a time, sometimes sedated, sometimes not, the theory being that the constant immersion would calm her nervous system. She hated the baths most of all. The vulnerability of being naked and helpless, the pruning of her skin, the way time seemed to stop when she was submerged. Sometimes she fantasized about slipping under the water and not coming up, but the nurses watched her too closely for that. Then there was the insulin shock therapy. They would inject her with increasing doses of insulin until her blood sugar dropped dangerously low, inducing a coma. The theory was that the shock would somehow reset her brain, cure her of her delusions. Violet would feel the injection, feel her consciousness slipping away, and then wake hours later disoriented and nauseous, with no sense of who she was or where she was. It took hours for her mind to reassemble itself each time, and she was never sure if she came back entirely the same person who had gone under. The doctors, there were several, each with their own theories and treatments, asked her endless questions. Did she still hear voices? Did she regret her actions in Rome? Did she understand that attempting to kill Mussolini had been wrong? Violet learned quickly that honesty was punished. If she said she heard voices, they increased her medication, thick pills that made her thoughts slow and her limbs heavy. If she said she didn't regret Rome, they scheduled more shock treatments, so she learned to lie to tell them what they wanted to hear. Yes, she was getting better. No, the voices had stopped. Yes, she understood now that she had been delusional. But inside, in the private space of her mind that they couldn't reach, no matter how many shocks they administered or chemicals they pumped into her, Violet remained unchanged. She knew what she had done and why. She knew that Mussolini was building an empire of violence and oppression. She knew that someone had needed to try to stop him. She had failed, yes, but failure didn't make the attempt wrong. The physical toll of the treatments was severe. She lost weight rapidly, her body unable to process the meager food after the insulin treatments. Her hair, when it began to grow back, came in white at the temples. Her hands developed a tremor from the medications, a shake that never entirely went away. But worse than the physical degradation was the psychological assault of being constantly told that her beliefs, her convictions, her sense of moral clarity were all symptoms of illness, that her understanding of good and evil was merely chemical imbalance, that her willingness to sacrifice herself was just suicidal ideation in disguise. After 6 months, they moved her to a different ward, one with slightly more freedom. She was allowed to interact with other patients during certain hours, to attend group activities in a common room. This was where Violet truly understood the depth of human suffering that institutions like St. Andrew's contained. She met women who had been institutionalized for decades, some for actual mental illness, but others for crimes as minor as having a child out of wedlock, or being too difficult for their husbands to control, or simply being inconvenient to their families. She met women who had forgotten their own names, who shuffled through the corridors like ghosts, so medicated they could barely form coherent sentences. One woman, Margaret, had been a suffragette. She had been arrested during a protest in 1913, force-fed during a hunger strike, and then when she continued to cause trouble after her release, her family had her committed. That was 23 years ago. Margaret was in her 50s now, gap-toothed and thin, but there was still a spark in her eyes when she talked about the movement, about the fight for women's votes. We won, you know, Margaret told Violet one afternoon in the common room. They were supposed to be doing occupational therapy, sewing or knitting, busy work to keep their hands occupied, but they were just talking. Women can vote now. We got it in 1918. I've never cast a ballot locked up in here, but we won. That's something, Violet said softly. Is it? Margaret's fingers worked automatically at her knitting, the needles clicking rhythmically. What good did it do me? What good does winning do if you're not around to see it? Violet had no answer for that. She thought about Mussolini, probably still in power, still giving his bombastic speeches, still sending his black shirts to beat and murder his opponents. Her single bullet had changed nothing. He had survived, thrived even, turned her assassination attempt into proof of his invincibility. And she was here, locked away, her life effectively over at 50 years old. The nights were the hardest, alone in her cell with nothing to distract her from her thoughts. Violet wrestled with despair. She prayed as she had always prayed, but God's voice, if it had ever truly been God's voice, was silent now. Maybe the doctors were right. Maybe she had been mad all along, and the voice she'd heard had just been her own fractured psyche giving her permission to do something violent and extreme. Maybe there was no divine purpose, no grand plan, just a sad, mentally ill woman who had wasted her life tilting at windmills. But then she would remember Mussolini's face in that split second after the bullet struck, the look of shock and vulnerability before he recovered and put on his mask of invincibility. She had done that. She had for just a moment shattered the illusion, and perhaps that was enough. Perhaps it didn't matter that she had failed to kill him. Perhaps what mattered was that someone had tried, that someone had stood up and said, no, this is not acceptable. This man must be stopped. Even if that someone was now locked in an asylum, forgotten by history, slowly being destroyed by insulin and isolation and the grinding machinery of institutional medicine. As 1927 became 1928 and 1928 became 1929, Violet developed what she thought of as her survival strategies, small rituals and mental exercises that helped her maintain her sense of self in an environment designed to erase individual identity. The asylum's routine was numbing in its predictability: wake at 6, breakfast at 7, medications at 8, therapy or treatments until noon, lunch, more therapy, dinner at 6, lights out at 9. Every day the same, every day blurring into the next, time becoming a thick, viscous substance that you moved through rather than something that moved past you. She began by reclaiming her mornings. The nurses would wake the ward by turning on the harsh overhead lights and walking through with a bell, but Violet trained herself to wake 10 minutes earlier while the ward was still dark and quiet. In those 10 minutes before the institutional day began, she would lie in her narrow bed and do what she called her memory exercises. She would picture places she had been: the streets of Rome at sunset, the interior of Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris, her family's estate in Ireland when she was a child. She would reconstruct them in as much detail as possible: the color of the light, the sounds, the smells, the feeling of being in those places. It was a way of reminding herself that she had lived a whole life before this, that she existed beyond these walls. After breakfast, during the period when they were required to sit quietly in the day room while the nurses watched them for signs of agitation or distress, Violet would recite poetry to herself. Not aloud, that would have been noticed, possibly interpreted as talking to voices, but silently in her mind. She had a good memory for verse, and she worked her way through everything she could recall: Wordsworth's Tintern Abbey, passages from Paradise Lost, Christina Rossetti's religious poems, even Irish ballads her nurse had taught her as a child. The rhythm of the poetry gave structure to her thoughts, prevented them from spiraling into despair or rumination. She was careful never to appear too content or too purposeful. The doctors were suspicious of patients who seemed too self-possessed, who appeared to be maintaining an inner life that the institution couldn't reach. She had seen it happen to other patients: a woman named Catherine, who wrote letters in her head to her children, who maintained a kind of dignity and autonomy despite everything, was subjected to more aggressive treatments until she broke, until she became compliant and empty. So Violet learned to perform a version of recovery that satisfied the doctors without actually surrendering herself. She would participate in their therapies, answer their questions with carefully calibrated responses, show just enough improvement to avoid the worst treatments, but not so much that they would expect her to genuinely believe she had been insane to attempt what she had attempted. The group therapy sessions were particularly challenging, led by a Dr. Hartwell, a Freudian who believed that all female mental illness stemmed from sexual frustration or rejection of traditional feminine roles. These sessions required patients to sit in a circle and discuss their pathologies. Dr. Hartwell would ask probing questions about their relationships with men, their sexual histories, their feelings about motherhood. When it was Violet's turn, he would inevitably focus on her unmarried status, her childlessness, her mannish interest in politics rather than domestic matters. "You must understand, Miss Gibson," he said during one particularly humiliating session, "that your attempt on Senior Mussolini's life was a displacement of deeper frustrations. The gun you see is a phallic symbol. Your inability to form normal relationships with men led you to this aggressive masculine act. You were trying to prove your potency, so to speak, to compensate for your lack of fulfillment as a woman." Violet had learned not to argue with such interpretations, no matter how absurd. She would nod, pretend to consider his words, say something like, "I've never thought of it that way, doctor. Perhaps you're right." Inside, she was screaming, but screaming achieved nothing except more medication, more treatments, more time in isolation. The other patients became, in an odd way, her community. There was Agnes, a former teacher who had been committed after a nervous breakdown following her husband's death. Agnes was gentle and kind, and she and Violet would sometimes sit together in the common room, not talking much, just finding comfort in each other's quiet presence. There was Ruth, much younger, barely 20, who had tried to drown herself in the Thames after her family discovered she was pregnant by a man who refused to marry her. Her baby had been taken away and given up for adoption, and she spent most of her time staring at nothing, lost in grief that the doctors insisted was merely hormonal. And there was Margaret, the suffragette, who became something like a friend. Margaret had been institutionalized so long that she had learned to navigate the system with a kind of cunning. She knew which nurses were sympathetic and which were cruel. She knew when to make herself invisible and when to cause just enough trouble to avoid being forgotten entirely. She taught Violet tricks how to palm medication and spit it out later. how to recognize the signs that a patient was about to be moved to the secure ward, how to write letters that would pass the censor's inspection but still contain coded messages about the true conditions inside. The thing you have to understand, Margaret told her one winter afternoon, their breath visible in the poorly heated common room, is that they want you to forget who you were before. They want you to believe that this, she gestured at the drab walls, the barred windows, the nurses watching them from the doorway, is all you are now, a patient, a case number, a diagnosis in a file. But you can't let them do that. You have to hold on to the person you were, even if you have to hide her. Have you held on? Violet asked, after all these years. Margaret smiled sadly. Some days better than others. Some days I wake up and I'm still that girl who threw a rock through a window at Parliament, who screamed that we wouldn't be silenced, who believed we could change the world. Other days I wake up and I don't know who I am anymore. The drugs, the treatments, the endless sameness of it all, it wears you down, but I try, every day I try to remember. Those conversations with Margaret sustained Violet through the worst periods, when the insulin treatments left her confused and disoriented for days afterward, when the medications made her so drowsy she could barely think, when the crushing boredom and isolation threatened to break her, she would remember Margaret's words. Hold on, don't forget who you are. Don't let them erase you. She also developed a kind of physical discipline during the hour of exercise in the yard. While other patients shuffled aimlessly or sat on benches, Violet walked. She would trace the perimeter of the yard over and over, counting her steps, maintaining a brisk pace. The nurses considered this harmless eccentricity, but for Violet it was essential. It kept her body strong, kept her mind focused, gave her a sense of control over something, even if it was just the number of steps she could take in an hour. Lights out, she would do exercises in the dark, push-ups against the wall, squats, stretches. The movements were small and quiet enough not to attract attention, but they reminded her body that it was hers, that it could be strong and purposeful even in this place designed to make her weak and compliant. Years passed. 1930, 1931, 1932. The world outside continued without her. She learned about events through fragments, newspapers that patients would occasionally smuggle in, conversations with new patients who brought news from outside. The Great Depression had begun. Germany had elected someone called Hitler. Italy was still under Mussolini's control, and he seemed more powerful than ever. Sometimes Violet wondered if anyone even remembered her assassination attempt. It had been 6 years, 7 years, 8 years, a lifetime ago. Another world. Her family never visited. She understood why she had embarrassed them terribly, confirmed all their worst fears about her mental state, but the abandonment still hurt. Her brother Willie had died in 1929, and she learned about it months after the fact from a brief note the hospital administrator showed her. "We thought you should know," he said, his tone suggesting that even this small kindness was more than she deserved. She grieved alone in her cell for Willie, who had tried to protect her, for the relationship they'd never been able to have, for all the years she'd lost and would never get back. By the mid-1930s, Violet had achieved a kind of equilibrium. She knew she would never be released. Attempted assassination of a foreign leader, even an unsuccessful attempt, even one dismissed as the act of a madwoman, was not something the British government would forgive or forget. She was an embarrassment, a potential diplomatic incident, safer locked away forever. So she stopped hoping for release and started focusing simply on endurance, on surviving each day with her mind intact, her sense of self preserved, her conviction that what she had done, whatever its outcome, had been right. She was 60 years old now, her hair completely white, her body thin and worn by years of institutional life and harsh treatments. But inside, in the parts of herself she kept hidden from the doctors and nurses, she remained Violet Albina Gibson, daughter of a baron convert to Catholicism, would-be assassin of a tyrant. They had locked her up, medicated her, shocked her, tried to convince her she was insane, but they hadn't broken her, not really, not where it mattered. In 1936, after 10 years in St. Andrew's Hospital, Violet was transferred to a different ward, not because she had improved, the doctors still considered her incurably insane, but because of overcrowding and budget cuts. The new ward was in an older part of the hospital, a Victorian-era building with high ceilings and drafty windows, housing patients who were considered stable enough not to require constant supervision, but too dangerous or disturbed ever to be released. The transfer brought unexpected freedoms. The ward had a library, a small room with perhaps 100 books, most of them donated decades ago, their pages yellow and brittle. Violet fell on those books like a starving person discovering food. She didn't care what she read, outdated histories, sentimental Victorian novels, even technical manuals on subjects she had no interest in. The act of reading, of engaging her mind with something beyond the asylum's walls, was like returning to life after years of being dead. She was also allowed to write letters now, though they were still censored by the staff. She wrote to her surviving sister Frances careful letters that never mentioned Rome or Mussolini or politics, just asking after family news, describing the weather, the books she was reading. Frances never replied. Violet wrote anyway, month after month, year after year. The act of writing, of imagining herself connected to the world outside, was what mattered. One afternoon in 1937, a new patient arrived on the ward, a woman named Helen who had been arrested trying to disrupt a fascist rally in London. Helen was young, barely 30, passionate and angry, and when she learned who Violet was, the Englishwoman who had shot at Mussolini, she sought her out immediately. "You're a legend," Helen said breathlessly, sitting down next to Violet in the common room without asking permission. "People still talk about what you did. The attempt on Mussolini, I've read everything I could find about it." Violet felt something shift inside her chest, a sensation she couldn't quite name. She had lived for so long with the assumption that she had been forgotten, that her act had been dismissed and erased from history. "I failed," she said quietly. "The bullet missed." "But you tried," Helen insisted. You stood up to him when everyone else was either supporting him or looking away. You showed he could be touched, that he wasn't invincible. That mattered. That still matters." They talked for hours that day and many days afterward. Well, Helen was well read in political theory, had been involved with communist and anarchist groups in London, and she treated Violet not as a patient or a curiosity, but as a comrade, someone who had fought the same fight. Through Helen, Violet learned about events in the wider world, the Spanish Civil War, where fascists and their opponents were now engaged in a brutal conflict, Hitler's rise in Germany and his alliance with Mussolini, the growing sense that another world war was coming. "Mussolini's still in power," Helen told her. "But you were right about him. Everyone can see it now. He's invaded Ethiopia, used poison gas against civilians. He's allied with Hitler. The man's a monster, exactly as you said." Violet absorbed this information in silence. She felt no vindication, only a deep sadness. If she had succeeded in 1926, how many lives might have been saved? How different might the trajectory of Europe have been? But she hadn't succeeded. The bullet had missed, and now the world was sliding toward catastrophe. "Do you regret it?" Helen asked her one day, "doing what you did?" Violet considered the question carefully. Did she regret spending 10 years and likely the rest of her life locked in an asylum? Did she regret the treatments, the medications, the isolation, the loss of everything she had been? Did she regret becoming a cautionary tale, a mad woman in the newspapers, someone whose family would rather forget she existed? "No," she said finally, "I don't regret it. I regret that I failed, but I don't regret trying." Helen smiled. "Good, because the world needs people willing to try even when the odds are impossible, especially when the odds are impossible." As the 1930s drew to a close and war broke out in Europe in 1939, Violet's world contracted further. The asylum went on emergency protocols, reduced food, blackouts at night, air raid drills. Some of the younger nurses left to join the war effort. Patients who had family willing to take them were quietly released to make room for potential casualties. But Violet remained too old, too notorious, too much of an embarrassment to be freed. She was 63 when the war began, 69 when it ended. She learned about major events through fragments: the fall of France, the Blitz, D-Day, the liberation of Europe, and finally in 1945, news that made her sit down suddenly, her legs unable to support her. Mussolini was dead, killed by Italian partisans as he tried to flee to Switzerland, his body strung up in a Milan piazza for crowds to spit on and desecrate. She felt nothing at first, just a vast emptiness. The man she had tried to kill 19 years ago was dead, but not by her hand. Not because of her act. She had been a footnote, a failed assassination attempt in 1926 that Mussolini had survived and used for propaganda. The real resistance had come from others, from the Italian people themselves, who had finally risen up against the fascist regime. But later, alone in her cell, Violet allowed herself to cry, not from sadness exactly, but from release. The thing she had dedicated herself to, the act that had cost her everything, was finished. The tyrant was dead. He had done terrible damage, helped start a world war, murdered thousands, oppressed millions, but he was dead, and she was still alive. She was 70 years old, and she had been institutionalized for 19 years. She would never leave St. Andrew's Hospital. She knew that with certainty now. She would die here, probably alone, probably unmourned, except perhaps by a few fellow patients. The nurses would record her death in their ledgers. Her body would be buried in the asylum's graveyard, and within a generation, no one would remember her name. But she had lived. She had seen injustice and tried to stop it. She had acted according to her conscience, even when it meant sacrificing everything. She had pulled that trigger in Rome and for one brief moment had shattered the myth of Mussolini's invincibility. It hadn't been enough, but it had been something, and in a world that often demanded women be silent, compliant, decorative, she had chosen to be dangerous instead. The years after the war were gentle in their own way. The treatment stopped, insulin shock therapy had fallen out of favor, and the doctors who had administered it had retired or died. The medications decreased. Violet was allowed more freedom within the hospital grounds, could walk in the gardens when weather permitted, could attend church services in the chapel. She was an old woman now, white-haired and fragile, no longer considered a threat to anyone. She spent her final years reading, writing letters that were never answered, talking with other long-term patients. Margaret, the suffragette, had died in 1944. Helen had been released after the war ended, gone back to political organizing. New patients came and went, and sometimes Violet would tell them her story if they asked. Most didn't believe her at first. How could this elderly woman have once tried to assassinate a dictator? But she would describe that morning in Rome in vivid detail, the weight of the gun in her pocket, the sound of the crowd, Mussolini's face in the instant the bullet struck. She died on May 2nd, 1956, 30 years to the day after she was committed to St. Andrew's Hospital. She was 79 years old. The cause of death was listed as heart failure, but really it was just age and exhaustion, the slow winding down of a body that had endured too much for too long. She died in her sleep, which was a mercy. The nurses found her in the morning lying peacefully in her narrow bed, her face calm. The hospital notified her family, who arranged for a simple burial in the asylum cemetery. No one attended the service except the chaplain and two nurses who had known her. There were no obituaries in the newspapers, no public acknowledgement of her death. Violet Albina Gibson, who had once stood in a Roman piazza and tried to change history, disappeared from the world as quietly as she had lived the last 3 decades of her life. But before she died, in those final years when she knew the end was approaching, Violet had written something, a letter perhaps, or a memoir. The records don't say. Whatever it was, she hid it in one of the library books tucked between the pages where she hoped someone might find it someday. In it, she tried to explain herself, to justify what she had done, not to the doctors or the courts, but to history itself. She wrote about hearing the voices, not auditory hallucinations, as the doctors insisted, but an internal moral clarity so strong it felt like divine command. She wrote about watching Mussolini's rise and understanding with terrible certainty that he would bring catastrophe to Europe. She wrote about the calculation she made was one life, even her own comfortable, privileged life, worth sacrificing to stop him, and she had decided yes, 1,000 times yes. She wrote about standing in that piazza with the gun in her hand, about the moment of pulling the trigger, about the failure of the bullet to strike true, about the decade and more she had spent locked away, punished not so much for attempting murder as for the audacity of trying a woman, a middle-aged, unmarried woman. How dare she think she had the right to judge a head of state, to take history into her own hands? And finally, she wrote about regret, not regret for the act itself, but regret that she had been alone, that no one had helped her, supported her, joined her in seeing what needed to be done. She wrote about how differently things might have gone if she had been part of a movement, a collective resistance, rather than one woman acting alone out of desperation and conviction. I do not ask to be remembered as a hero, she wrote in those final pages. I was not heroic. I was simply a woman who could not stand by while evil flourished. I acted as my conscience demanded, and I paid the price willingly. If I have any legacy, let it be this, that there are things worth sacrificing everything for, that moral clarity, even when it leads to failure, is preferable to comfortable complicity, that the voice of conscience, whether you call it God or justice or simply human decency, must be heeded even when the whole world calls you mad for listening. The letter, if it was ever found, vanished into history, but the truth she tried to express in it, the conviction that drove her to that piazza in Rome, lived on in other ways, in every person who stood up against injustice, knowing the cost would be terrible. In every act of resistance, successful or failed, that said no to tyranny, in every moment when someone chose courage over comfort, action over silence. Violet Albina Gibson died forgotten by history, but she died unbroken, unbowed, with her conscience clear and her sense of self intact. They had locked her away for 30 years, tried to convince her she was insane, subjected her to treatments meant to break her will and erase her convictions, and through all of it she had maintained the one thing they could never take from her, the knowledge that she had seen evil and tried to stop it, that she had lived according to her deepest values, that she had refused to be silent, even when silence would have been so much easier. In the end, perhaps that was victory enough. Not the victory of killing Mussolini. That bullet had missed, and history had taken its own cruel course. But the victory of maintaining one's humanity in an inhuman place, of preserving one's dignity in circumstances designed to destroy it, of holding fast to truth and justice even when the whole world insists you're mad. That was Violet Gibson's legacy, not a successful assassination, but a successful life measured not in achievements or recognition, but in faithfulness to conscience and courage under impossible circumstances, in the quiet, unwitnessed heroism of simply refusing to surrender. Claude is AI and can make mistakes. Please double-check responses.